The formation of the Soviet Union in 1922 marked the birth of a new political and social experiment in global history. It was a direct result of the 1917 Russian Revolution, which overthrew the centuries-old Romanov monarchy and paved the way for the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, to seize power. The Bolsheviks envisioned a society free from class-based oppression, where workers and peasants would unite to govern themselves through socialist principles. In the aftermath of the revolution and the subsequent Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923, the Bolsheviks solidified their control over much of the former Russian Empire. Recognizing the diverse ethnic and cultural makeup of the vast territories they controlled, Lenin and his government established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, as a federal union. Initially, it included 4 republics: the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, the Ukrainian SSR, the Belarusian SSR, and the Transcaucasian SSR, which encompassed present-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The USSR structure was unique, designed to give nominal autonomy to its constituent republics while maintaining centralized control from Moscow. This dual structure aimed to unify the diverse populations under the banner of socialism while preventing the resurgence of separatist movements that had plagued the Russian Empire. However, in practice, the centralized power of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, limited the autonomy of the republics, as Moscow dictated policies on economic planning, military organization, and cultural expression. The formation of the Soviet Union also reflected a broader ideological mission. Lenin and the Bolsheviks sought to spread socialism globally, seeing the USSR as the first step in an international proletarian revolution. This ambition was enshrined in the Communist International, Comintern, established to promote communist movements worldwide. The Soviet Union's establishment, therefore, was not merely a political restructuring but a declaration of ideological intent to reshape the world order. While the creation of the USSR represented a bold vision of unity and progress, it also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The forced integration of diverse peoples under a single political system often led to tensions, particularly as the Soviet government prioritized ideological conformity over cultural or national autonomy. These underlying issues would resurface in later decades, contributing to the Soviet Union's eventual unraveling. Key point 2. Lenin's leadership, 1917 to 1924. Vladimir Lenin, the architect of the Bolshevik Revolution, played a pivotal role in shaping the Soviet Union's foundational years. His leadership from 1917 until his death in 1924 laid the ideological and structural groundwork for the USSR, despite the immense challenges the fledgling state faced. Lenin's vision was driven by Marxist principles, which he adapted to the specific conditions of Russia, advocating for a proletarian dictatorship to transition society from capitalism to socialism. Lenin's initial task was consolidating power after the October Revolution of 1917. The overthrow of the provisional government plunged Russia into chaos, with widespread resistance from monarchists, liberals, and other socialist factions. This led to the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923, during which Lenin's leadership was instrumental in ensuring the Red Army's victory over the White Army and various foreign interventionist forces. The brutal war decimated the economy, caused millions of deaths, and left the Bolsheviks in control of a shattered country. One of Lenin's most controversial policies during this time was war communism, an economic system designed to supply the Red Army with resources while ensuring the survival of the state. This policy involved requisitioning grain from peasants, nationalizing industry, and centralizing production. While it enabled the Bolsheviks to maintain their war effort, it led to widespread famine, economic collapse, and significant discontent among the population. Recognizing these failures, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921, a pragmatic retreat from pure socialism. The NEP allowed limited private enterprise, revived small-scale trade, and granted peasants the right to sell surplus produce, stabilizing the economy and restoring some public support. Lenin's leadership was also marked by the ideological consolidation of the Communist Party. He believed that the party must serve as the vanguard of the revolution, guiding society through a period of dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin institutionalized this vision through the establishment of a one-party state, suppressing political opposition and dissent. The Cheka, the Soviet secret police, became a powerful tool for maintaining control, often using harsh and violent measures against perceived enemies of the revolution. In addition to internal governance, Lenin focused on international revolutionary efforts. He founded the Communist International Comintern in 1919, aiming to unite workers and communist parties worldwide under Soviet leadership. Lenin envisioned the Soviet Union not as an isolated experiment, but as the nucleus of a global socialist revolution. This ambition would shape Soviet foreign policy for decades, as the USSR became a beacon for leftist movements across the world. However, Lenin's health began to deteriorate after a series of strokes in the early 1920s, which weakened his influence over the party. His final years were marked by his growing concern over the direction of the Soviet state, particularly the increasing centralization of power and the rising influence of Joseph Stalin. Lenin's leadership left an indelible mark on the Soviet Union, but his premature death in 1924 left critical questions unanswered about the balance between ideology and governance, as well as the future trajectory of the communist state. Joseph Stalin's rise to power following Lenin's death in 1924 marked a dramatic transformation of the Soviet Union. Stalin consolidated his authority through a combination of political maneuvering, ideological rigidity, and ruthless suppression of rivals. His era is defined by rapid industrialization, brutal collectivization, totalitarian governance, and significant geopolitical influence, but also by immense suffering, repression, and loss of life. Stalin's first priority was to secure his control over the Communist Party and the Soviet state. Through a series of strategic alliances and betrayals, he sidelined key rivals like Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev, ultimately emerging as the unchallenged leader by the late 1920s. Stalin centralized power to an unprecedented degree, positioning himself as the ultimate authority in all matters of state and ideology. One of the defining features of Stalin's rule was his ambitious program of industrialization. Believing that rapid economic development was essential to secure the Soviet Union against external threats and to build socialism, Stalin launched the first five-year plan in 1928. This plan focused on heavy industry, including steel, coal, and machinery, as well as infrastructure projects like railways and hydroelectric dams. While these efforts transformed the USSR into a major industrial power, they often came at great human cost. Workers endured harsh conditions, long hours, and strict discipline, while widespread resource mismanagement and unrealistic targets led to inefficiency and suffering. Stalin's policies extended to agriculture through the process of collectivization, which aimed to replace small, private farms with large, state-controlled collectives. This policy was intended to increase agricultural productivity and provide surplus grain for export to finance industrialization. However, it resulted in widespread resistance from peasants, many of whom were labeled as kulaks, wealthy farmers, and subjected to violent repression. The forced requisitioning of grain and the disruption of traditional farming practices caused catastrophic famines, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, which led to the deaths of millions. Stalin's regime was characterized by an atmosphere of pervasive fear and paranoia, culminating in the Great Purge of the late 1930s. Under the guise of eliminating enemies of the state, Stalin orchestrated mass arrests, executions, and deportations. Political rivals, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were targeted, with millions sent to the Gulag labor camps or executed. The purges decimated the Soviet military and political leadership, leaving a legacy of distrust and instability. On the international stage, Stalin's era saw significant geopolitical developments. Initially, he pursued a cautious foreign policy, signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, which included a non-aggression agreement and the division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. However, the Nazi invasion of the USSR in 1941 forced Stalin to join the Allied powers in World War II. The Soviet Union played a decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, with monumental battles such as Stalingrad and the Red Army's eventual capture of Berlin. However, the war came at a tremendous cost, with over 20 million Soviet citizens killed and vast destruction across the country. Stalin's leadership extended into the post-war period, as he sought to consolidate Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, laying the groundwork for the Cold War. He established a series of satellite states under communist regimes, creating a buffer zone against perceived Western threats. Domestically, Stalin continued to maintain his grip on power through propaganda, surveillance, and the suppression of dissent. His cult of personality reached its zenith, with every aspect of Soviet life shaped to glorify his leadership and the ideals of socialism. Stalin's collectivization policy, initiated in the late 1920s, was a cornerstone of his broader vision to transform the Soviet Union into a modern, industrialized socialist state. The policy aimed to consolidate millions of small, individually owned farms into large, state-controlled collective farms, or kolkhozy. Stalin argued that collectivization was essential to increase agricultural efficiency, ensure a stable food supply for the rapidly growing industrial workforce, and generate surplus grain for export to finance industrialization projects. However, the reality of collectivization was far more destructive than its proponents envisioned, leading to widespread suffering, resistance, and one of the deadliest famines in human history. The process of collectivization was implemented with brutal force. Peasants, who had enjoyed some autonomy under Lenin's new economic policy, NEP, were now compelled to surrender their land, livestock, and equipment to the collective farms. Many peasants resisted, seeing collectivization as a return to feudal servitude under the state. In response, the Soviet government launched a propaganda campaign demonizing wealthier peasants, or kulaks, as enemies of socialism. The state adopted a policy of dekulakization, which involved confiscating property, mass arrests, and deportations to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions. Tens of thousands of kulaks were executed, and millions more were displaced, leaving entire communities devastated. The disruption caused by collectivization had catastrophic effects on agricultural productivity. Farmers, deprived of personal incentives and control over their land, were often unmotivated or incapable of meeting the state's production quotas. Additionally, the government's insistence on requisitioning large portions of the harvest for urban consumption and export left rural areas with insufficient food. The situation was worsened by poor planning, inefficiencies in collective farming, and harsh weather conditions in some regions. The consequences were especially devastating in Ukraine, where collectivization combined with deliberate policies of grain requisitioning led to the Holodomor, a man-made famine that killed millions between 1932 and 1933. Soviet authorities forcibly seized grain from Ukrainian peasants, even as they starved. Borders were closed to prevent people from fleeing, and any acts of resistance were met with brutal reprisals. Although the Soviet government denied the famine at the time, historical evidence suggests it was exacerbated or even deliberately engineered as a means to crush Ukrainian nationalism and enforce Soviet control. The famine extended beyond Ukraine, affecting other parts of the Soviet Union, including Kazakhstan and parts of Russia. In total, it is estimated that between 5 and 7 million people died as a result of famine during the collectivization period. These deaths, combined with the mass displacement of peasants, created lasting demographic and economic scars across the Soviet countryside. Despite the catastrophic human toll, Stalin and his regime declared collectivization a success. By the mid-1930s, the majority of Soviet farms had been collectivized, and the state had established greater control over the agricultural sector. The grain exports financed industrial projects and helped bolster the Soviet Union's position on the international stage. However, the long-term costs of collectivization, both in terms of human lives and agricultural productivity, would haunt the Soviet Union for decades. Rural resentment, environmental degradation, and inefficiencies in food production remain persistent issues, contributing to the systemic flaws of the Soviet planned economy. The Great Purge, also known as the Great Terror, was one of the darkest and most infamous episodes of Joseph Stalin's rule. Taking place between 1936 and 1938, this period was marked by widespread political repression, mass arrests, show trials, executions, and the forced labor of millions in the Gulag system. Stalin's objective was to eliminate any perceived threats to his power, consolidate his absolute authority over the Communist Party, and reshape Soviet society through fear and coercion. The purge not only decimated the Soviet elite, but also traumatized the broader population, leaving a lasting legacy of paranoia and repression. Stalin's paranoia was a driving force behind the purge. After securing his leadership position in the 1920s, Stalin grew increasingly distrustful of his colleagues and subordinates, believing that opposition to his rule could emerge from within the Communist Party. This fear was heightened by ideological concerns, as Stalin sought to eradicate any remnants of the old Bolsheviks, those who had been close to Lenin and who might challenge his interpretation of Marxist-Leninist doctrine. The assassination of Sergei Kirov, a prominent party leader and a potential rival, in 1934 provided Stalin with a pretext to launch a campaign against so-called enemies of the state. While the true circumstances of Kirov's death remain unclear, it served as a catalyst for the wave of repression that followed. The purge unfolded in stages, beginning with high-profile show trials of prominent Communist Party members. These trials were carefully orchestrated spectacles, where defendants were accused of crimes like espionage, sabotage, and treason. Many of the accused were forced to confess under torture or threats to their families. Figures such as Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin, former allies of Stalin, were executed after their public confessions. These trials served to legitimize Stalin's actions in the eyes of the public, portraying the purged individuals as dangerous conspirators undermining the Soviet state. The repression quickly extended beyond the party elite. Tens of thousands of military officers, engineers, academics, artists, and ordinary citizens were accused of subversive activities. Stalin's fear of military disloyalty led to the purge of the Red Army, including the execution of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and other senior officers. This decimation of military leadership weakened the Soviet Union's readiness for the looming threat of World War II. The secret police, initially known as the NKVD and led by figures such as Genrikh Yagoda, Nikolai Yezhov, and later Lavreny Beria, played a central role in carrying out the purge. The NKVD operated under quotas, arresting individuals based on predetermined numbers, regardless of evidence or guilt. Suspects were often subjected to brutal interrogations, forced to incriminate themselves and others. Entire families were arrested, and the accused were either executed or sent to the Gulag, a vast network of labor camps where many perished from harsh conditions, overwork, and malnutrition. The purge created a climate of fear and suspicion throughout the Soviet Union. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members denounced each other to the authorities, often out of fear or to settle personal grievances. This atmosphere eroded trust and cohesion within Soviet society, as loyalty to Stalin and the Communist Party became paramount. Stalin's propaganda machine reinforced this dynamic, portraying him as the protector of socialism and the Soviet people, while framing the purged individuals as traitors and counter-revolutionaries. Although the Great Purge formally ended in 1938, its effects were long-lasting. The loss of experienced leaders in the military, government, and industry created significant challenges for the Soviet Union, particularly as it faced the demands of World War II. Moreover, the culture of repression, surveillance, and denunciation established during this period persisted throughout Stalin's rule and beyond, shaping the character of the Soviet state. World War II was a defining chapter in the history of the Soviet Union, testing the nation's resilience, military strength, and political strategies under Joseph Stalin's leadership. The war, known in the Soviet Union as the Great Patriotic War, was marked by immense suffering, unparalleled heroism, and a pivotal role in the Allied victory over Nazi Germany. However, it also revealed the vulnerabilities of Stalin's regime and reshaped the Soviet Union's position on the global stage. The Soviet Union initially sought to avoid direct involvement in the conflict through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty signed with Nazi Germany in August 1939. The pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing the USSR to annex territories in eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina. This agreement provided a temporary reprieve for the Soviet Union, allowing Stalin to focus on internal consolidation and military preparedness. However, the pact also drew criticism from other nations and left the USSR diplomatically isolated. The illusion of peace shattered on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The surprise attack, involving millions of German troops, caught the Red Army unprepared. Years of political purges had severely weakened the Soviet military, and initial German advances were swift and devastating. By late 1941, Nazi forces had occupied vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia, and were threatening Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. Stalin's leadership during this crisis was a mix of rigid control and strategic adaptation. Initially paralyzed by the invasion, Stalin quickly recovered and mobilized the Soviet state for total war. He adopted a scorched earth policy, ordering the destruction of infrastructure and resources to deny them to the advancing Germans. Factories were dismantled and relocated east of the Ural Mountains, ensuring the continuation of industrial production. Propaganda emphasized patriotism, unity, and the defense of the Soviet motherland, invoking historical and cultural symbols to rally the population. The turning point in the war came with the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, one of the bloodiest and most decisive engagements in military history. The Red Army, under the command of generals like Georgy Zhukov, encircled and defeated the German Sixth Army in a brutal campaign of urban warfare. This victory marked the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive, as the Red Army began pushing German forces westward. Other significant battles, such as the Battle of Kursk in 1943, further solidified the Soviet Union's momentum. Kursk was the largest tank battle in history and ended in a decisive Soviet victory, crippling Germany's ability to conduct large-scale offensives. On the home front, the Soviet people endured unimaginable hardships. Millions of civilians were killed, and entire cities were destroyed in the fighting. The siege of Leningrad lasted nearly 900 days, leading to the deaths of over 1 million people from starvation, exposure, and bombardment. Despite these immense losses, the Soviet population displayed extraordinary resilience, contributing to the war effort through labor, resource production, and military service. Women played a crucial role, not only in factories and farms but also on the front lines as snipers, pilots, and medics. As the Red Army advanced into Eastern Europe and eventually Germany, the Soviet Union's role in shaping the post-war order became clear. The capture of Berlin in May 1945 symbolized the USSR's triumph over Nazi Germany and cemented its status as a superpower. However, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe also laid the foundation for tensions with the Western Allies, as Stalin sought to establish a sphere of influence in the region. This ambition clashed with the ideals of democracy and self-determination promoted by the United States and its allies, setting the stage for the Cold War. The human cost of World War II for the Soviet Union was staggering. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, soldiers and civilians, lost their lives, representing the highest casualty count of any nation involved in the conflict. The war devastated infrastructure, agriculture, and industry, but it also forged a sense of national pride and unity in overcoming an existential threat. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany became a cornerstone of its historical narrative, celebrated annually on Victory Day and deeply embedded in the national identity. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union faced the immense challenge of rebuilding a nation devastated by the conflict. Nearly every aspect of Soviet life, its cities, infrastructure, economy, and population, had been deeply scarred by the war. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape was rapidly shifting, with the Soviet Union emerging as a global superpower in direct competition with the United States. This period of reconstruction and rivalry marked the beginning of the Cold War, a decades-long ideological, political, and military struggle that defined global affairs. The scale of destruction in the Soviet Union was unprecedented. The war had ravaged entire regions, leaving major cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Kiev in ruins. Over 25 million Soviet citizens were left homeless, and essential industries, transportation networks, and agricultural systems were in shambles. Stalin's government responded with an ambitious reconstruction plan, prioritizing heavy industry, infrastructure, and military capacity over consumer goods and living standards. The Fourth Five-Year Plan, 1946 to 1950, aimed to restore pre-war production levels as quickly as possible. Central to this reconstruction effort was the labor of millions, including demobilized soldiers, ordinary citizens, and prisoners in the Gulag system. Despite the immense human cost, by the early 1950s, the Soviet Union had not only rebuilt its industrial base, but also surpassed pre-war production levels in key sectors such as steel, coal, and machinery. This rapid recovery was achieved through strict central planning, state control of resources, and significant sacrifices by the Soviet population, who continued to endure shortages of food, housing, and consumer goods. Reconstruction efforts were deeply intertwined with the Soviet Union's broader geopolitical goals. As the Red Army liberated Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation during the war, it established pro-Soviet regimes in countries such as Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. These nations became part of the Soviet sphere of influence, forming a buffer zone against perceived Western threats. The establishment of communist governments in these countries was often achieved through coercion, rigged elections, and suppression of opposition, leading to widespread resentment and tension within the region. The ideological divide between the Soviet Union and the United States solidified in the immediate post-war years, giving rise to the Cold War. This rivalry was rooted in conflicting visions for the post-war world order. The Soviet Union sought to spread communism and protect its interests through the establishment of satellite states, while the United States aimed to promote democracy, capitalism, and the principle of self-determination. The Truman Doctrine of 1947, which pledged American support to nations resisting communist influence, and the Marshall Plan, which provided economic aid to rebuild Western Europe, were seen by Stalin as direct threats to Soviet security and ideology. The division of Germany became one of the earliest flashpoints in this growing conflict. The Soviets controlled East Germany and the eastern sector of Berlin, while the Western Allies managed West Germany and West Berlin. In 1948, Stalin attempted to force the Western Allies out of Berlin by imposing the Berlin blockade, cutting off all land access to the city. The Western powers responded with the Berlin airlift, delivering supplies to the residents of West Berlin by air for nearly a year, until Stalin lifted the blockade in 1949. This event underscored the deepening division of Europe into two blocs: the Eastern Bloc, dominated by the Soviet Union, and the Western Bloc, led by the United States and its NATO allies. Domestically, Stalin maintained his grip on power with an iron fist. The post-war period saw a continuation of political purges, censorship, and surveillance. The Soviet government intensified efforts to control intellectual life, suppress dissent, and promote a cult of personality around Stalin. The wartime sense of unity and shared purpose was replaced by a climate of suspicion and repression. Meanwhile, Stalin's paranoia about internal and external enemies grew, leading to the persecution of ethnic minorities, religious groups, and perceived political dissidents. The early years of the Cold War also saw the Soviet Union achieve significant scientific and military milestones. In 1949, the USSR successfully tested its first nuclear bomb, ending the United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons and initiating an arms race that would define much of the Cold War. This achievement marked a turning point in global power dynamics, as the Soviet Union demonstrated its capacity to challenge the United States on a technological and strategic level. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 marked a significant turning point in the history of the Soviet Union, as the country transitioned from the oppressive totalitarianism of Stalin's rule to a period of relative openness and reform under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. This era, often referred to as the Khrushchev thaw, saw attempts to liberalize Soviet society, address the excesses of Stalinism, and improve relations with the West. However, it was also a time of contradictions, as Khrushchev's reforms faced resistance from conservative elements within the Communist Party, and his policies often resulted in unintended consequences both domestically and internationally. Khrushchev's ascent to power was not immediate or uncontested. Following Stalin's death, a power struggle ensued among the Soviet leadership. Key figures such as Lavrentiy Beria, Georgy Malenkov, and Vyacheslav Molotov vied for control. Khrushchev emerged as the dominant leader by consolidating his position within the Communist Party and orchestrating the arrest and execution of Beria, the feared head of the NKVD. By the mid-1950s, Khrushchev had established himself as the first secretary of the Communist Party and the de facto leader of the Soviet Union. One of Khrushchev's most defining acts was his denunciation of Stalin's legacy during the 20th Party Congress in 1956, an event that sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union and the communist world. In a secret speech, Khrushchev condemned Stalin for his cult of personality, mass purges, and abuse of power, accusing him of betraying Leninist principles. This speech, known as the secret speech, marked the beginning of De-Stalinization, a process aimed at dismantling the repressive structures and policies associated with Stalin's rule. De-Stalinization had profound effects on Soviet society. Thousands of political prisoners were released from the Gulag, censorship was relaxed to some extent, and intellectual life experienced a brief resurgence. Writers, artists, and filmmakers were encouraged to explore themes that had been suppressed under Stalin, leading to a flourishing of cultural expression. The Soviet public, long accustomed to fear and repression, experienced a sense of cautious optimism and hope for a more humane socialism. Khrushchev also sought to reform the Soviet economy and improve living standards for ordinary citizens. He prioritized the production of consumer goods, housing, and agricultural output, aiming to move away from the heavy industry focus of Stalin's era. His agricultural policies included ambitious projects such as the Virgin Lands Campaign, which encouraged the cultivation of previously unused land in regions like Kazakhstan and Siberia. While initially successful in boosting grain production, these efforts were plagued by poor planning, over-reliance on monoculture, and environmental degradation, leading to long-term inefficiencies and failures. In foreign policy, Khrushchev pursued a strategy of peaceful coexistence with the West, seeking to reduce the risk of direct military confrontation while competing ideologically and economically. This policy was tested during key events such as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, when Soviet tanks brutally suppressed an uprising against communist rule, and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in particular, revealed the dangers of the Cold War arms race and underscored the volatile nature of Khrushchev's leadership, as his decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba was seen as both bold and reckless. Khrushchev's leadership style was marked by a mix of bold ambition and erratic decision-making. He introduced numerous reforms, such as decentralizing economic management and reorganizing the Communist Party, but these efforts often lacked coherence and consistency. His personality, charismatic but impulsive, alienated many within the Soviet leadership. By the early 1960s, dissatisfaction with his policies and leadership style had grown among both reformers and conservatives. In 1964, Khrushchev was ousted in a bloodless coup orchestrated by his colleagues within the Communist Party, including Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin. His removal marked the end of the Khrushchev thaw and the beginning of a more conservative and stagnant era under Brezhnev's rule. Despite his shortcomings, Khrushchev's time in power left a lasting impact on the Soviet Union, as it represented a departure from the extreme repression of Stalinism and an attempt, however flawed, to create a more dynamic and humane socialist system. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 stands as one of the most significant and controversial events in the Soviet Union's later history. Initiated under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, the invasion marked a decisive shift in Soviet foreign policy, as the USSR sought to prop up a fragile communist regime in Kabul against internal rebellion and increasing influence from external forces, particularly the United States. The conflict, which dragged on for nearly a decade, became a costly and unwinnable war, exacerbating the Soviet Union's domestic and international difficulties and ultimately contributing to its eventual decline. The roots of the Soviet invasion can be traced to Afghanistan's turbulent post-independence history. After gaining freedom from British and Persian influence in the early 20th century, Afghanistan remained a predominantly tribal society with fluctuating internal power struggles. In 1978, the Saur Revolution brought a communist government to power, led by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan (PDPA). This government quickly faced resistance from conservative factions, Islamic militants, and rival tribal groups who were deeply opposed to communist reforms. The situation worsened when Hafizullah Amin, a radical communist, took control of the government in 1979, consolidating power through violent repression and political purges. Faced with the collapse of the Afghan communist regime, the Soviet Union intervened with the belief that a communist-controlled Afghanistan was vital to Soviet security. The Brezhnev Doctrine, which asserted the right of Soviet intervention in any socialist state facing external or internal threats, provided ideological justification for the invasion. The USSR sought to prevent the spread of Islamic extremism, Western influence, and the rise of a militant opposition supported by the United States and other Western powers. The Soviet military launched a massive invasion in December 1979, with tens of thousands of troops entering Afghanistan. The operation quickly became a quagmire, as the Soviet forces faced fierce resistance from Afghan Mujahideen fighters, who were armed and supported by the United States, Pakistan, and other Western allies. The Mujahideen utilized guerrilla tactics, launching ambushes and conducting attacks on Soviet supply lines. The harsh terrain, unfamiliar to Soviet forces, further complicated the occupation. The Soviet leadership underestimated the strength of Afghan resistance and the complexities of the conflict. Soviet forces were forced to adopt increasingly brutal measures to maintain control, including widespread massacres, destruction of villages, and the use of scorched earth tactics. However, these tactics alienated the local population and deepened support for the insurgency. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet military found itself bogged down in an unwinnable war with no clear exit strategy. Domestically, the invasion had significant consequences for the Soviet Union. The war placed immense economic strain on the Soviet economy, diverting resources away from domestic needs. The cost of maintaining the occupation, supplying troops, and dealing with an ongoing insurgency drained the USSR's already fragile economic stability. At the same time, the Soviet political system faced growing criticism and unrest. Public dissatisfaction, combined with a lack of progress in Afghanistan, led to increased calls for reform within the Communist Party. Internationally, the Soviet invasion deepened tensions with the United States and its allies. The U.S. responded by providing substantial military and financial support to the Mujahideen, heightening Cold War rivalries. This escalated the conflict into a proxy war, with both superpowers engaging in indirect combat through their respective allies. The presence of Soviet troops in Afghanistan became a symbol of Soviet weakness and overreach, leading to global condemnation and isolation. In 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev succeeded Brezhnev as General Secretary of the Communist Party. Gorbachev's reformist agenda, which focused on glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, fundamentally altered the USSR's approach to the war. Under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union began to withdraw troops, acknowledging the futility of continued occupation. The Geneva Accords in 1988 laid the groundwork for the final Soviet withdrawal in 1989. The withdrawal did not mark the end of the conflict. The post-Soviet period saw Afghanistan descend into civil war, with competing warlords and factions vying for power. However, for the Soviet Union, the invasion of Afghanistan became a symbolic and material drain that contributed to its ultimate collapse. The inability to achieve a decisive victory, along with the internal economic and political challenges exacerbated by the conflict, signaled the Soviet Union's decline on both the domestic and international stages. Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985 marked a significant turning point in the history of the Soviet Union. His leadership ushered in a period of unprecedented reform, seeking to modernize the Soviet economy, improve political transparency, and foster more open relations with the outside world. However, Gorbachev's ambitious reforms, Glasnost, openness, Perestroika, restructuring, and democratization, ultimately contributed to the unraveling of the Soviet Union, leading to its collapse in 1991. His attempts to reform the Soviet system were met with deep resistance from conservative elements within the Communist Party, nationalist movements in the republics, and the economic strains of maintaining a superpower status. Glasnost aimed to increase transparency in government operations and reduce the culture of secrecy and censorship that had dominated Soviet society for decades. For the first time since Stalin's rule, Soviet citizens were encouraged to speak out about problems in society, and some previously banned literature, media, and cultural works were permitted. While Glasnost brought fresh ideas and a sense of political openness, it also unleashed long-suppressed grievances, criticisms, and demands for change, creating an atmosphere of unpredictability and dissent. Perestroika, on the other hand, was focused on restructuring the Soviet economy. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet system, rooted in central planning and state control, was failing to meet the needs of a rapidly changing world. Perestroika sought to introduce market-oriented reforms within a socialist framework, allowing limited market mechanisms, decentralizing economic decision-making, and promoting efficiency and innovation. However, these reforms often clashed with entrenched bureaucratic interests and the rigid structures of the state, resulting in slow and uneven progress. Gorbachev's democratization efforts further weakened the authority of the Communist Party. Democratization introduced limited reforms to the electoral process, allowing for contested local elections and the creation of competing political institutions. These measures empowered reformist factions and emboldened nationalist movements in the republics, especially those in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Georgia, who sought greater autonomy or independence from Moscow. The combination of these reforms, while well-intentioned, exposed the systemic weaknesses of the Soviet Union. The economy continued to stagnate as Gorbachev's attempts at modernization were hampered by a lack of resources, outdated infrastructure, and the inefficiencies inherent in a state-dominated economy. Industrial output declined, inflation rose, and consumer shortages persisted, creating widespread dissatisfaction among Soviet citizens. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's policies of openness also encouraged nationalist movements that had long been suppressed under Soviet control. In regions like the Baltics, Ukraine, and Central Asia, ethnic tensions resurfaced as local populations demanded greater autonomy or outright independence. The collapse of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, further exposed the fragility of the Soviet Empire. Internationally, Gorbachev's foreign policy sought to de-escalate Cold War tensions, leading to arms control agreements like the INF Treaty and the reduction of Soviet military presence in Afghanistan. However, these actions weakened the Soviet Union's global influence, leaving the U.S. as the sole superpower in a unipolar world. By 1991, Gorbachev's reforms had paved the way for the complete disintegration of the Soviet Union. Amidst economic crisis, growing nationalist movements, and political instability, republics began declaring independence. The failed coup attempt by hardline communists in August 1991 further weakened Gorbachev's authority. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords, officially dissolving the Soviet Union and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States (CS). Gorbachev's vision of a reformed, modern Soviet Union had collapsed under the weight of its contradictions, marking the end of an era. The fall of the Soviet Union in December 1991 marked the beginning of a new era for the former Soviet republics, each of which faced a complex and often turbulent transition from a centralized, planned economy to a market-oriented system. The transition period brought both opportunities for reform and growth, as well as numerous challenges, including economic instability, political uncertainty, and social dislocation. For the newly independent states, the task of establishing viable governance structures and fostering economic development became a significant priority, though progress varied widely across the region. One of the most pressing issues for the post-Soviet states was the transition from a command economy to a market economy. For decades, the Soviet Union had relied on central planning, where production targets, distribution, and resource allocation were determined by the state. In contrast, the transition to a market system required the privatization of state-owned enterprises, liberalization of trade, and the establishment of a legal framework to support property rights and entrepreneurship. This transition, however, was often uneven and marred by corruption, inadequate infrastructure, and the legacy of bureaucratic inefficiency. The shock therapy approach adopted by some former Soviet republics, such as Russia, saw a rapid liberalization of prices, the dismantling of state controls, and the rapid privatization of industries. While this method did lead to short-term economic growth and increased entrepreneurial activity, it also caused significant economic hardship. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and a stark rise in income inequality resulted in widespread public discontent. The early 1990s were characterized by social unrest and economic hardship, with many citizens struggling to adapt to the new realities of a market-driven economy. In contrast, countries such as Belarus and Turkmenistan maintained a more controlled approach to reform. These nations retained a stronger role for the state in the economy, maintaining significant state enterprises and preserving a relatively centralized political system. While this approach provided stability, it also limited economic dynamism and political freedom, ultimately delaying more comprehensive economic and social reforms. Political instability was another major challenge in the post-Soviet space. Newly independent states faced the task of creating functioning democratic institutions and establishing a rule of law in environments where political corruption, weak state institutions, and ethnic tensions persisted. In many cases, power struggles emerged between political factions and leaders seeking to consolidate power. In some republics, such as Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, separatist movements and conflicts, often fueled by ethnic divisions, further complicated the political landscape. The rise of nationalism and ethnic tensions also became a defining feature of the post-Soviet period. While the Soviet Union had suppressed ethnic identities and promoted a pan-Slavic or Soviet identity, the collapse of the USSR unleashed a wave of nationalistic sentiment. This resulted in the resurgence of historical grievances, territorial disputes, and ethnic conflicts, such as those in Chechnya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Transnistria, which threatened the sovereignty and stability of several newly independent states. Additionally, the Soviet Union's collapse left a void in terms of regional integration and economic collaboration. While some efforts were made to establish economic cooperation within the Commonwealth of Independent States (CS), these efforts were limited as national interests often clashed with the desire for collective progress. Countries faced challenges in developing trade partnerships, reducing dependency on Russia, and ensuring sustainable economic growth, which resulted in a fragmented economic landscape across the former Soviet space. Socially, the post-Soviet transition brought both positives and negatives. While education, healthcare, and social services were initially well-developed under Soviet rule, these sectors faced significant strain due to economic downturns and underfunding. On the other hand, the era of post-Soviet reform also saw a rise in civil society activism, a renewed focus on human rights, and greater engagement with global institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund (IMF). In summary, the post-Soviet transition was a challenging period for the former Soviet republics. Each state grappled with the legacy of decades of Soviet control, while simultaneously navigating the complexities of building independent political, economic, and social systems. Despite the diverse outcomes of these transitions, the overarching theme was one of uncertainty, transformation, and the pursuit of a stable future amid profound change. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia emerged as the largest and most powerful successor state. As the dominant power in the former Soviet space, Russia played a central role in shaping the political, economic, and security dynamics of the post-Soviet region. However, this role was complex and multifaceted, marked by efforts to consolidate influence, manage internal challenges, and navigate relations with neighboring states. Russia's approach to post-Soviet relations was often characterized by a mix of cooperation, assertiveness, and sometimes conflict, reflecting its desire to maintain a sphere of influence while accommodating new realities of an increasingly independent and diverse set of states. One of Russia's primary goals in the post-Soviet era was to retain influence over the countries that had once been part of the Soviet Union. This was driven by a combination of geopolitical interests, economic dependencies, and historical ties. Russia sought to maintain control over key economic resources, security arrangements, and cultural connections, believing that the strength of the Russian state depended on a degree of integration with its former territories. Moscow used various means, including economic aid, political pressure, and military interventions, to retain influence over neighboring countries. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Russia's relations with neighboring states were often strained by territorial disputes, ethnic conflicts, and disagreements over sovereignty. For instance, conflicts in Chechnya and Abkhazia strained relations with Georgia and other post-Soviet nations. Russia's military interventions in regions like Chechnya and its involvement in the conflict in Transnistria demonstrated Moscow's willingness to assert its authority when territorial or political interests were at stake. The presence of Russian military bases, peacekeeping forces, and pro-Russian separatist movements within some post-Soviet states further exacerbated tensions and fueled nationalist sentiments. Economically, Russia played a significant role in the region through its control of energy resources, particularly natural gas and oil. Russian energy companies, often state-owned or closely connected to the government, became central players in the economies of several post-Soviet states, leading to concerns over dependence and monopolistic control. For instance, Russian gas pipelines supplied much of Europe and former Soviet countries, providing Moscow with leverage over pricing and distribution. Countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova became deeply reliant on Russian energy, making them vulnerable to political and economic pressures. In terms of diplomacy, Russia sought to establish regional organizations such as the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, with the aim of maintaining some semblance of Soviet-era unity and cooperative mechanisms. However, these organizations often struggled to achieve cohesion, as differing national interests and political ideologies among member states weakened Moscow's influence. Despite these efforts, Russia faced competition from Western institutions such as the European Union and NATO, which also sought to engage with post-Soviet states through integration and security partnerships. Russia's approach to regional conflicts often involved a balancing act between direct intervention and indirect influence. While the West criticized Russia for aggressive tactics and militarization, Russian leaders portrayed these actions as necessary to protect national interests and maintain stability in the region. In many cases, this resulted in a cycle of conflict and instability, where Moscow's involvement in local disputes deepened divisions and hindered long-term resolution efforts. The early 21st century witnessed a more assertive Russian foreign policy under leaders like Vladimir Putin, who emphasized a strong, centralized state and a return to a more influential role for Russia on the global stage. This era saw increased interventionism, not only in conflicts within the post-Soviet region, but also in broader geopolitical issues such as the Syrian civil war, the Ukraine crisis, and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Putin's vision of a Eurasian Union aimed to integrate former Soviet republics into a closer political and economic partnership, but this has been met with resistance from many post-Soviet states seeking independence and Western engagement. In summary, Russia's role in post-Soviet relations has been characterized by a mix of cooperation, assertiveness, and conflict. Moscow has sought to maintain influence over its former territories while managing challenges posed by a more independent and fragmented post-Soviet space. Despite its ambitions, Russia has faced difficulties in achieving long-term stability and influence, as tensions with neighboring states persist and the challenges of a rapidly evolving global landscape remain unresolved. The Soviet Union's economy was characterized by its centralized, state-controlled nature, which aimed to achieve rapid industrialization, self-sufficiency, and equality among its citizens. However, despite these ambitious goals, the Soviet economic model ultimately faced significant challenges, inefficiencies, and stagnation, contributing to the Union's eventual collapse. Central planning, while successful in producing heavy industrial output, failed to meet the diverse and growing needs of the population, leading to widespread economic hardship, shortages, and a reliance on outdated technology and production methods. At the heart of the Soviet economic system was the principle of central planning, which assigned economic goals through five-year plans managed by the government. This method was intended to ensure maximum production and distribution of goods, guided by Marxist-Leninist ideology. However, the rigid bureaucracy responsible for implementing these plans lacked flexibility, innovation, and responsiveness to local or individual needs. The emphasis on quantity over quality resulted in a focus on meeting output targets rather than producing goods that met consumer demands. One of the most significant problems was the inefficiency of state-owned enterprises. Since enterprises were guaranteed state funding and did not operate in a competitive market environment, there was little incentive for them to innovate or improve productivity. Factories were incentivized to meet production quotas rather than optimize resources, leading to waste, outdated machinery, and low-quality goods. The inefficient allocation of resources and the inability to adapt to technological advancements significantly hampered economic progress. Agriculture was another sector that struggled under the Soviet system. Collectivization, implemented by Stalin in the 1930s, sought to consolidate individual peasant land into large collective farms. While this policy was initially aimed at increasing agricultural output, it led to numerous problems, including poor planning, lack of motivation among collective farmers, and widespread mismanagement. Shortages of basic food items became common, with reliance on inefficient farming methods leading to low yields. Moreover, environmental degradation due to unsustainable agricultural practices further exacerbated the crisis in Soviet agriculture. The Soviet Union also heavily invested in military and heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods and social welfare. The military-industrial complex became the primary driver of the economy, diverting resources from essential sectors such as healthcare, education, and technology development. This skewed economic structure created shortages of basic consumer goods, housing, and even basic infrastructure in urban areas. The lack of innovation meant that Soviet technology often lagged behind that of Western countries, resulting in a competitive disadvantage in global markets. Another critical issue was the disparity between regions and industries. The Soviet Union attempted to impose a uniform approach to economic development across its vast territory, but this led to uneven outcomes. While some regions, particularly those with natural resources like oil and gas, experienced modest growth, others, such as rural areas and peripheral regions, struggled economically. Inadequate infrastructure and uneven distribution of resources created regional disparities that were difficult to resolve within the centralized system. Corruption and inefficiency within the Soviet bureaucracy further worsened economic conditions. The emphasis on fulfilling production targets created opportunities for mismanagement, bribery, and nepotism. Managers were often more concerned with meeting quotas rather than maintaining high standards or responding to economic realities, which weakened the overall effectiveness of the economy. Despite attempts at reform, such as Khrushchev's push for increasing consumer goods and decentralization, the deep-rooted issues of inefficiency, lack of innovation, and the inability to adapt to a rapidly changing global economy persisted. By the time Gorbachev came to power in the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union faced an economic crisis that could no longer be contained through modest reform efforts alone. The Soviet economy had become increasingly outdated, inflexible, and unsustainable, contributing to the broader political and social challenges that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nationalism and ethnic tensions played a crucial role in the eventual disintegration of the Soviet Union. For decades, the Soviet state had suppressed ethnic identities and promoted a pan-Slavic or Soviet identity rooted in the ideals of socialism and centralized control. However, as the system weakened under the weight of economic stagnation, political repression, and reform efforts, nationalist movements within the republics began to gain momentum. These movements, fueled by historical grievances, cultural diversity, and a desire for greater autonomy or independence, became significant drivers of the USSR's collapse. Under Stalin and subsequent Soviet leaders, ethnic and national identities were systematically suppressed in favor of a unified Soviet identity. The Soviet Constitution granted ethnic republics formal rights to self-determination, including secession. Yet in practice, these rights were often ignored or limited by Moscow. Minority groups were expected to assimilate into the Soviet system, and any deviation from the official ideology was met with harsh repression. Ethnic communities were subject to forced resettlements, political persecution, and cultural erasure to maintain Soviet control. However, this policy of enforced unity began to unravel as economic and political crises mounted. Gorbachev's reforms, particularly Glasnost and Perestroika, unintentionally opened the floodgates for ethnic grievances that had been suppressed for decades. For the first time, ethnic minorities were given a platform to express their dissatisfaction with Soviet rule. The relaxation of censorship allowed for a re-emergence of cultural and historical narratives, fueling nationalist movements in regions such as the Baltic states, Ukraine, Georgia, and Central Asia. In the late 1980s, ethnic tensions became increasingly visible, particularly in regions with deep-seated historical and ethnic divides. In the Baltics, for example, movements in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania sought independence from Soviet control, emphasizing their distinct cultural, linguistic, and historical identities. In Ukraine, a strong sense of national identity began to rise, fueled by historical experiences of repression and starvation under Soviet policies like collectivization. Similarly, in regions like Chechnya and Abkhazia, ethnic minorities demanded autonomy, further straining Soviet governance. The Soviet leadership struggled to manage these demands for greater autonomy and independence. The conservative hardliners in the Communist Party viewed nationalism as a threat to the Soviet Union's unity and sought to suppress these movements through force and legal repression. However, these measures were often ineffective in the face of widespread grassroots support for nationalist causes. In many cases, Soviet attempts at maintaining control only exacerbated the conflict, as ethnic groups rejected Soviet rule entirely. The rise of nationalism was also intertwined with economic and political inequality. Soviet policies often favored certain ethnic groups or regions, leading to resentment and calls for greater regional autonomy or independence. The disparity between the center and the periphery became more pronounced as central resources were disproportionately allocated to industrial hubs in Russia and other Soviet core regions, leaving peripheral republics economically disadvantaged. This inequality deepened regional disparities, with ethnic minorities feeling alienated and politically marginalized. Furthermore, the collapse of the Soviet Union left a power vacuum in many regions, where nationalist movements seized the opportunity to assert their sovereignty. In some cases, such as in the case of Georgia's secessionist regions like Abkhazia and South Ossetia, conflicts erupted, leading to full-scale wars with Moscow-backed separatist groups. Similarly, Chechnya became a flashpoint for ethnic and religious conflict, with separatist movements violently clashing with Russian federal forces. Russia's response to these nationalist movements often alternated between heavy-handed military intervention and more conciliatory efforts to negotiate autonomy. However, these attempts rarely led to lasting peace or stability, and tensions continued to simmer in many regions long after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In summary, nationalism and ethnic tensions were central to the Soviet Union's collapse. The suppression of ethnic identities and the promotion of a centralized Soviet identity created long-standing grievances that, when given the opportunity to surface, became a driving force for independence and regional autonomy. These movements destabilized the Soviet Union, forcing its eventual disintegration as ethnic and nationalist demands could no longer be contained by a failing centralized state. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 left a profound and lasting legacy on Russia and the countries that once comprised its empire. From political structures and economic systems to cultural identities and geopolitical influence, the Soviet period shaped the post-Soviet states in numerous ways. While the legacy continues to influence current dynamics within these nations, the challenges and opportunities they face are deeply rooted in their Soviet past. For Russia, The end of the Soviet Union marked a period of transition from a superpower to a country navigating a new role in the world. The Soviet state had long been defined by its dominance over a vast empire, and the loss of control over the republics was a traumatic experience for the Russian political elite and population alike. Russia's struggle to redefine its identity was further complicated by the economic and social hardships that accompanied the transition to a market economy, as well as the internal challenges of managing territorial disputes, nationalist movements, and the legacy of authoritarianism. One of the most significant aspects of the Soviet legacy in modern Russia is the centralization of power. The Soviet system concentrated authority within the Communist Party and government institutions, leaving little room for democratic participation or rule of law. This centralized model has persisted to some extent in post-Soviet Russia, with power increasingly consolidated under the presidency and a dominant executive branch. Vladimir Putin's leadership exemplifies this trend, as he has reinforced a strong, centralized state apparatus reminiscent of Soviet governance, although with modern adaptations to a more competitive and globalized world. Economically, Russia's Soviet legacy has left an imprint on its dependence on natural resources like oil and gas. The Soviet Union relied heavily on heavy industry and the military-industrial complex, while consumer goods and innovation were often deprioritized. This legacy has resulted in Russia's continued vulnerability to fluctuations in global commodity prices, limiting its ability to diversify economically. While efforts have been made to modernize and liberalize certain sectors, much of the Soviet-era industrial base remains a significant part of Russia's economy. Culturally, the Soviet Union's promotion of a homogenized, collectivist society has influenced modern Russian identity. While the Soviet Union sought to erase ethnic and regional differences in favor of a unified Soviet identity, post-Soviet Russia has experienced a resurgence of regionalism and ethnic diversity. However, remnants of Soviet propaganda, collective memory, and education systems continue to shape societal values, nationalism, and perceptions of history. The emphasis on certain historical narratives, such as the heroism of Soviet leaders during World War II, remains pervasive in public discourse. In the former Soviet republics, the legacy of the USSR varies widely based on individual nation-state experiences. Countries like Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Georgia experienced the Soviet period with heavy repression, forced Russification, and cultural suppression. These states have sought to distance themselves from the Soviet legacy, embracing nationalism and European integration as a counterbalance. Conversely, nations like Belarus and Armenia have retained closer ties to Russia, maintaining influence through trade, military alliances, and shared cultural heritage. Economically, many post-Soviet republics have struggled to transition from Soviet-style economies to market-based systems. Issues of corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and regional disparities persist, often exacerbated by the legacy of Soviet industrialization, collectivization, and central planning. Furthermore, the absence of strong democratic institutions, a legacy of Soviet authoritarian rule, has hindered the development of political stability and economic prosperity in some regions. Geopolitically, the Soviet Union's collapse created new borders and shifting alliances that have shaped modern conflicts and cooperation. Territorial disputes, like those in the South Caucasus, Ukraine, and Moldova, reflect the continuing struggles of managing Soviet-era legacies, including ethnic divisions, autonomy demands, and secessionist movements. Russia's attempt to preserve influence in these regions reflects its ongoing desire to shape the post-Soviet space through diplomacy, economic pressure, and military involvement. In summary, the legacy of the Soviet Union has left a deep imprint on Russia and the former Soviet republics. While each nation has had its own trajectory, the political, economic, and social structures established under Soviet rule continue to influence modern governance, identity, and regional cooperation. As these countries move forward in a rapidly changing world, the challenge remains to reconcile their past with the demands of contemporary global challenges.